I've spent a long time as a big Andy Kaufman nerd, so that's kind of my relationship to Taxi.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's the guy from the REM song, right?
Yeah.
Welcome to I'd Buy That for $1, a podcast about inexpensive, common, and underappreciated records that are waiting to be rediscovered. I'm your host, Sean Hartman, enthusiastic consumer of D batteries.
I am Jeremy Ruggles, NBA trade analyst critic.
I'm Peter Cook, Super Bowl 12 MVP.
I'm Dustin Krcatovich, 1984 Olympic curling champion.
I have to look this up, but I don't believe you guys.
There's a lot of athleticism on the podcast.
Yeah, Sean mostly sticks at AA batteries.
Yeah, I'm just an enthusiastic consumer over here. Just happy to be here as per usual.
Does anyone get my reference, Super Bowl 12?
No.
What year do you think that was, Super Bowl 12?
1978, maybe?
You got it, partner.
Ooh, what else happened in 1978, Peter?
Something else related to football.
A major touchdown was performed.
Yeah, by Bob James. But Bob
Exactly.
James is not an athlete, at least not to my knowledge. Maybe I'll learn differently tonight or today, whatever you're listening to this, listener.
Well, before we steer too far away, who's this Dustin guy we got on the podcast? Dustin, tell us about yourself a little bit.
Oh, who, me?
Yeah.
Well, I am a music and film writer, currently based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, after spending about 7 years in Portland. Got bylines for The Quietus, Under the Radar, Esquire, and a bunch of other places. And I'm a DJ and mostly a dollar record DJ when I can help it.
Well, it sounds like you are just well qualified for this here podcast, sir.
Prime candidate.
Well, thank you.
Dustin and I have actually been talking for months now about getting him on the show. At one point, we were going to try and coordinate an in-person guest spot on the podcast, and for circumstances outside of everyone's control, that has become impossible for a while now.
Yeah.
But happy to have you on the program. Excited to talk about Bob James' touchdown from 1978, if people couldn't guess what the podcast was about.
I'm honored that this is the one that I'm here for.
Hell yeah. Perfect starting point.
You should play the people Bob James before you listeners get too excited.
That's exactly what I was going to suggest. How about we kick off with the opening track, the ultra famous theme song from everybody's favorite sitcom, Taxi. This is Angela on Touchdown.
song, Angela, is such a banger. And he didn't write that to be the Taxi theme song.
No.
Okay.
No, the title track from Touchdown.
Yeah,
is actually,
Touchdown. I just learned that. That's wild. I can't
Yeah.
imagine. That sets the tone so perfectly for the show Taxi, the Angela song,
Yeah.
and Touchdown is a very different vibe.
Yeah, it sounds more like the theme from SWAT or something. I mean, not quite, not quite, but it's more of a traditional like theme song.
It's
Kind of song.
very 70s and all. Yeah, it sounds like something on a cops show from the 70s
Yeah.
or something.
To me, Angela is like kind of the quintessential mid to late period Bob James song too, because it starts off like those first few seconds are just pure cheese, and then it just instantly like rescues itself, 20 seconds into the song and gets funky as hell. And that's the Bob James signature right there.
I mean, I was gonna say the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, he fucking invented this. He's the king of it.
He's masterful at making something that sounds like it's going to be extremely corny, and then moving it into these directions that you don't expect.
Yeah. And it's still like being corny often, but still being
Oh, yeah.
so fucking good that you just don't care anymore.
Yeah.
It's so good. Okay, so what is everybody's level of familiarity with Bob James and also with the show Taxi? Peter, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, so that's all tied together for me. When I was 14 years old in 8th grade, so we're talking 1995 here, 25 years ago now, I had become friends with this cool cat named Ryan Wilson. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but he was my first friend who talked about literature, art, music, not in the same way that my friends who talked about Star Wars and X-Men and Jurassic Park, he was already coming at it from, even if he wasn't necessarily studied at like a collegiate level at that point, it was like a worldly level that he was kind of approaching it at the age of 13, 14. And we talked a lot of music, and we were really into hip hop, and he got me into the Doors, and he started talking about this cat, Bob James. And right around that same time, Nick at Night started putting reruns of Taxi on, and at some point I noticed that the theme song was credited to Bob James. And this was right around the same time I started listening to the LPs in our household, and my family had just inherited a bunch of records from a relative on my dad's side, and there was a copy of Bob James' Heads, the album that precedes this, in there. Mm-hmm. So I think Ryan had the album Touchdown, and I started talking about the show Taxi, and he watched it. It was like, oh my God, they got Bob James as the theme song on there. That blew our minds. And so I wasn't familiar with Touchdown other than Angela because it was on Taxi. I don't think I got a copy of Touchdown until I was in high school. I got it on CD, but I did have a copy of Heads, and I really dug that record. And I think I got a copy of Cool, which is a 90s album that he did it was credited to Bob James and Earl Klugh. Is that how you say his name? Klugh? I don't know how you say the guitarist.
I've always said Clue, but I can't tell you
with
100% certainty if that's accurate.
I haven't got a clue, but I think that's it. we got to get some Bob James cheese in here, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like Bob James, at that time, I talked about how Ryan and I were into hip hop and we were into stuff like the Doors. I almost feel like Bob James was somewhere in between those two. And that makes sense to me that we would have responded to this kind of music. It was I felt like we were off on our own trip. And so in my 20s, when I started finding out that my jazz friends didn't consider this stuff legit, it kind of broke my heart.
I had like a slightly similar experience in some ways. I had a very natural, authentic, I guess, introduction to Bob James. So like I started working at a record store when I was 19 and thought I knew absolutely everything about music, and all these older people around me were just wrong, and I was gonna change things up. And I think I was just like bored at work one day putting on records that had cool covers I'd never heard, and of course I put on Bob James 1 because it's just the sickest album cover. Mm-hmm. And I put it on, I was like, this is tight. Like, why does this sit around all the time? Because this was like, 10 plus years ago when you could still find Bob James 1 and 2 for dirt cheap everywhere. And I remember the owner of the store, Steve, was like, why are you listening to Bob James? People are going to think you're a weirdo. And I just didn't understand what he was talking about. I was like, this is sick in every way. It's like got the coolest album cover and it's funky as hell. Like, why would anybody not like this? And then, eventually like realize like, oh, they get a lot cheesier after the first two records, and maybe I only need to listen to like the first two. And then, you got that galaxy brain thing going on. You get older and you realize, no, actually pretty much all the Bob James records are good for different reasons.
And you said you were telling us while we were listening to the first track, the theme song from Taxi, that you have never seen an episode of Taxi.
Yeah, I think I watched like an Andy Kaufman highlights reel after seeing Man in the Moon, but I don't think I've ever seen an episode all the way through. And that would have been, before I even listened to Bob James 1. So like the fact that he did the theme song really never clicked with me, because it just like wasn't something that was on my radar very much. But
yeah, I've maybe seen every episode of Taxi, because I watched it pretty religiously around that same time.
What's your top 5 favorite episodes of Taxi?
Anyone with where Latka becomes Vic Ferrari. I thought that was the coolest thing when Andy Kaufman went into a different character. And of course, to me, at 14, I didn't have any other context for Andy Kaufman. I didn't understand that I was seeing a performance art legend on a mass consumed television show. That was almost a weird anomaly.
Yeah. I mean, like you got two legends that came from much weirder backgrounds involved with the show, Bob James and Andy Kaufman.
Yeah. Yeah. And Christopher Lloyd was on the show too.
Oh, okay. There you go. It shows how much I know about it. Danny
DeVito, Judd Hirsch, Mary Lou Henner, the woman who can remember everything that's ever happened to her and the specific date. She has like the best memory on the planet. Yeah, there were a lot of talented people involved with Taxi. Judd Hirsch. Tony Danza.
I was about to say, you didn't mention Tony Danza.
Yeah. I think that's the first mention of Tony Danza on this podcast.
Won't be the last.
Yeah, it won't be the last. Exactly. The floodgates have been opened. So, Dustin, I know you were very excited about talking about Bob James with us. You want to tell us where that excitement comes from?
Yeah. I had watched Taxi a little bit as a teenager and then a little bit in my 20s because of Andy Kaufman, but that doesn't really play into my excitement about Bob James, or at least not significantly. I really came in through the side door on this one. So in the mid 60s, before he had really like pursued this direction, Bob James did a record for ESP Disc, or the Bob James Trio, I should say, called Explosions. He recorded it while he was still had a lot of connections here in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. And it's just a completely out record, debatably the first record that combines free jazz and experimental, like 20th century experimental composition.
Mm-hmm.
That's what got me interested. And I was like, wait, so this is the same guy who did the theme from Taxi.
Yeah. And how did that happen?
Worlds apart.
That was half of it. And then the more mundane, but still very important aspect was I was a regular at this store here in Ann Arbor, Encore. It was called Encore Recordings at the time. Now it's called Encore Records, and it's under different ownership. The photographer Doug Coombe worked there at the time, and he was always pushing the stuff that was like the hardest sell on me, or like he knew that I was into like noise music and abrasive punk rock and things like that. And he was like, yo, man, do you know the Bob James track Nautilus? Like that was something I was going to be excited about. But of course, I mean, it's a great track and it's been sampled like 3,000 times.
Mm-hmm.
Him pushing that on me was also important because it gave me context. And that happened before hearing Explosions. And so it was a slow road in from there. Because all those records are so cheap and common, I had time and money to spend with all of them until, well, not all, but certainly the first 6 that he's most well known for, and the ones that are the cheap and extremely easy to find records. Just I've spent a good amount of time with all of them, except actually weirdly Heads is the one that I have not.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's the one that I was mainly familiar with at 14, so that one means a lot to me, but this one's up there for me too. Touchdown. And I didn't realize that His first solo album was one, and then there was two. I didn't realize that he continued that trend more creatively. Like Heads is his fifth, and there's a 5 cent piece on the front of it, and then Touchdown is his sixth. A touchdown is worth 6 points.
Right.
That's wild. I didn't realize.
I literally never made those two connections before until just now.
It's as cheesy and nerdy as everything about Bob James. And I say that with absolute love, like the deepest affection.
Yeah, he's very consistent in his cheesiness.
As Dustin touched on there, a lot of people consider Bob James to be the most sampled artist in hip hop history, specifically because of his two tracks, Nautilus and
Take Me to the Mardi Gras.
Yeah, Take Me to the Mardi Gras. Yep. Two of the most sampled songs ever, and he's got a bunch of other songs that have been sampled a lot too. He's had such a weird career trajectory, a lot of twists and turns, and he's remained successful during almost his entire career, which is kind of absurd for a musician, especially a jazz musician.
Yeah.
So we're not even going to bother asking Jeremy
about
his background with Bob James.
I was just about to.
Okay.
Jeremy, what do you know about Bob James / Taxi?
Listen, you guys need my input here because I think there are going to be a lot of listeners who are not down with smooth jazz and know nothing about it. I just heard this record like 2 hours ago before we started recording here. I have never seen Taxi and can't even fathom what the show is about. Literally, while I'm listening to this record, I'm Googling why do people like smooth jazz to try and like get some kind of
asking the internet.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand like what is it about this that people like, because it's never attracted me. Listening to it, it sounds like music that's like scrubbed free of emotion or something. So I guess in reading about it, I became very intrigued that smooth jazz is actually an extremely reactionary genre that was reacting to bebop and free jazz. And
doesn't reactionary mean conservative?
I mean, in a sense.
Or reactive, reactionary. I don't know. I'm not. I don't mean to word police you.
Yeah, it's a literal reaction to the direction that jazz was heading, and with free jazz and bebop, and it's these people taking, a hard turn away from the direction it's going in, and that kind of led to a lot of soul jazz and pop jazz influence, and then the pop and rock music that it was merging with was also getting far out and edgy and all that. So then there was like a further reaction away from that. And that's from my internet sleuthing how smooth jazz came to be. I don't know if that's accurate understanding, but it was intriguing to me at the least.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you've brought up some valid points, and I think that I can see, I saw that this album was very low rated on some jazz critics. The reviews were 1 star out of 5 and stuff like that. And I can get that, especially in the time, these albums like this were probably just considered commercial bids and didn't contain any artistic value. But I think that time has been much kinder to them, like what they kind of paved the way for and helped develop, especially in stuff like hip hop and how much Bob James has been sampled.
Here's another thing I learned, though, that is kind of tied to that. The term smooth jazz was not coined until 1987, and there was an LA radio station that was trying to create a station based on like market analysis of what people want to hear. And the term they came up with was smooth jazz. And then they were reaching back into these catalogs that when this music was happening, they weren't calling it smooth jazz. And it wasn't, it doesn't have that baggage that we give smooth jazz now.
Yeah. It's like no German musicians were calling themselves krautrock, in the late 60s until the British press started calling it that. And then some despised it, some grabbed onto it. no one was saying, like, people now make vaporwave. That's probably 5 years gone now. I'm probably totally. Yeah, no one was saying they were making smooth jazz then.
Yeah, I think there's some parallels to what we've talked about in regards to disco as well, where too often people will use smooth jazz or disco as a term for music that they don't like. Whereas when you ignore the originators of the genre, the people who are breaking ground and trying something new, I mean, you're doing you're doing the whole genre a disservice, because like what you said with a lot of the CTI Records camp that Bob James was a part of, they weren't out to like, let's figure out how to make jazz more accessible for people. Their whole thing was like, there's been a lot of instrumental jazz that's been made and we really want to make something new. Let's focus more on texture. Let's combine a lot of classical music elements into this. Let's, listen to what other genres are doing outside of jazz and take inspiration from it. And it became successful, at least for some people. And then years later, when the corporate music machine had figured out how to put a label on it and capitalize off it in the best way, then all of this stuff retroactively became smooth jazz. And some of it was good and some of it was absolutely amazing, like Mr. Bob James.
Mm-hmm. And honestly, I think a lot of this stuff goes a lot harder than it gets credit for. The grooves on these Bob James records are incredible. His very melancholic sense of melody is, I would take umbrage to the idea that it's devoid of emotion. I think it doesn't wear it on its sleeve. Like, I mean,
I think there is a journey when you listen. If you actually take the time to invest yourselves in a Bob James track, it's not just background music. There is a journey that you can go on.
Oh, totally.
Right. It could certainly be like dentist office music. That's
elevator rock.
Yeah. That's part of what's interesting about it, is that it doesn't just push in your face like, this is the emotion that you should be experiencing, or this is the level of attention that you should afford this. It's like Brian Eno's notion of ambient music. It rewards attention, but it doesn't require it.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it with Bob James, actually. I was going to say, a lot of this music, it works very well in the background. Like, you don't have to think about it. It's pleasant. It's not offensive. But then when you sit down and focus on the grooves and the players and the textures and the directions that they're going, it's amazing. And the more you listen to it, the more it keeps jumping out at you. And I will say, like, his earlier stuff, like Bob James 1 and 2 and the CTI stuff, is probably a little bit easier for people to get into who aren't as familiar with the kind of like cheese levels of his later 70s stuff like Touchdown.
Yeah.
Part of the reason I wanted to start with Touchdown is it's probably the easiest record of his to find.
Yeah. In dollar bins across America.
Yeah. At any given time.
Totally. Like, at this point, like, most places are going to be trying to get $10 to $20 out of one, and like $10 for Bob James 2, etc. But you can still find Touchdown and Heads and Lucky 7 and BJ4 for $1 if you're looking.
Should we do another track before we move on with the discussion?
I was just about to say the same thing. It seemed like a perfect point to play the title track, Touchdown. Let's do it.
This is the one that was going to be the theme for Taxi. listening to this last night, I noticed that track had the saxophone on it. And before I even looked at the credits, I thought to myself, that's got to be Dave Sanborn. That the cheese is unmistakable. And sure enough.
Yeah, the cheese, yet the undeniable level of talent.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have massive respect for Dave Sanborn, especially because he hosted one of the greatest shows of all time to air on national television. I believe it was called Night Music.
That's correct.
Yeah. And they featured all kinds of wild artists on there. You'd get like Sun Ra performing. You'd see Bongwater featuring Screamin' Jay Hawkins and Bob Weir from the Grateful Dead performing on there together. Per Ubu. It's crazy, the artists who performed on Night Music.
Well, and once again, it just goes back to what we were saying about, like, this is accessible music, but there's an inherent weirdness to it. And a lot of the people making it were weirdos. Like, almost all these guys were involved with some, like, pretty out music at points in their career. And it's not like they were viewing this as a sellout, just like another way of trying something new and, like, expanding music.
Yeah, they're, as Jeremy was saying, that his roommate had commented on it. He said it sounded like MIDI music because the players are so expert that they almost don't sound like human beings.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this music is extreme in what it's doing.
Extreme in that it's like going all out, full in on what it's doing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like taking an ideal and like going all the way to it.
Definitely.
Running with no brakes.
Yeah. It's the Merzbow of smooth jazz.
Yeah.
For
Apt
sure.
comparison. I'm sure Merzbow would be proud.
Yeah.
You had to be ready to take a bullet for a motherfucker if you played on Bob James Touchdown.
Yeah, that's right.
You guys want a quick, real brief Bob James biography here?
Yeah, this is
Please.
funny. I want to touch on this because something about this style of music has never led me to go like, ooh, what's the mystique here? What's the tortured artist behind this music? I never have really dipped into who Bob James is or how, I know that he did Explosions on ESP disc, which was a pretty far out there record. And then his music becomes more and more accessible to this degree. And that's, and he has continued on successfully for many years.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody's really described Bob James as a tortured artist.
Yeah, that's my
he
point.
seems to have he's like self-described as basically the luckiest musician. In a lot of the like interviews I'd read with him, he's like, I don't know why I'm successful at like everything I do. I just keep trying things I want to do, and then people give me a lot of money for it. Is basically like what his life has been like since college.
Even his name is nondescript.
Yeah,
Bob
I know.
James.
I would say like maybe like the biggest struggle he's had is keeping on top of getting paid for all of the samples of his music and like suing people that try and get away with it.
That's the biggest hurdle he's had.
Yeah, I think he sued Madlib like 5 years ago for an unlicensed sample.
But it's rare in that he's not mad about it, and he actually respects the process. He just wants to get paid.
Yes, although he also seems to sometimes make comments to the effect of like he appreciates being noticed and he appreciates like the level of respect that his music has, but he kind of feels like sampling wouldn't exist if people were better musicians.
Well,
Yeah, like it's great that they did this, and I guess it's interesting, but if they learned how to play an instrument, they wouldn't have to do this. And it's like, that's not really what's happening, but I mean, I guess that's more of a progressive opinion than most people your age, so we'll take it.
right.
Yeah, it's entirely missing the point.
Right.
Yeah, repurposing.
I always think back to this time when I was having a small argument with someone who was saying that, sampling in electronic music couldn't ever be at the level of an instrument. Like, it's just pushing buttons and that can't be an instrument. And I was like, well, do you consider music made on a keyboard to be music? Because those are just glorified buttons there, buddy. And he's like, oh, wait a minute.
You blew his mind.
Yeah.
A piano is just like a row of buttons.
Yep. Bob James. In 1939, on Christmas Day, the world was gifted a savior who would forever alter the course of music. I'm going to also assume that he was probably conceived in an elevator, and maybe that explains.
Was this bio written? Is this from his website?
No.
Sean's
But
own
maybe
version.
it will be after he hears this episode. I don't know. So he was born in Marshall, Missouri, and then he moved to Michigan, where I believe he currently resides, actually.
Yeah. As of 5 years ago, he definitely resided in Traverse City. I don't know if that's still the case, but
Yeah, he also appears to be worth about $15 million, so he might have a few houses.
could be.
If I had known when I was doing an internship up in Traverse City that he was around there, I would have been looking or listening.
I'm also just going to say that it makes a lot of sense that the king of elevator music would live in the whitest city in the world. If you ever want to play the worst drinking game in the world, go to Traverse City, Michigan, and take a shot every time you see a person of color, and you will be sober for days.
Yeah.
Verified.
Yep. That checks out.
Attest to that.
Well, anyway, he moved to Michigan. He went to college at U of M. And then in 1962, he took part in a jazz festival, Battle of the Bands of sorts, at Notre Dame, which was judged by Quincy Jones, who was so impressed by young Bob and his trio that he got him signed to Mercury Records. And in 1963, he put out his actual first record, Bold Conceptions.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's right. There is one before Explosions.
Yeah, the other record that everyone forgets about. He's got two mostly forgotten records before.
Well, I mean, that's what happens when you name your first record that's what happens when you name your first popular record one. People assume there's nothing before that.
Oh, totally. It's his fault that people have forgotten about those first two records. But yeah, I don't own Bold Conceptions. I've listened to it online a little bit. It never really jumped out at me too much. It just kind of feels like a pretty standard 60s jazz record. I don't know if you guys have listened to that one before.
No, the earliest I've heard is Explosions.
Yeah. I mean, it shows some promise, but it didn't blow me away.
Yeah, it's like the equivalent of like a director's first movie. You know, it's like maybe some of the, if you really look or listen hard, you're picking up on some of the stuff they touch on later, but it doesn't really like have their like signature style yet.
Right.
Yeah, and this is also, his first couple albums are like a decade before the rest of his work that he's known for.
Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, that first record was also produced by Quincy Jones. It's just like, one speaks to like how cool of a guy Quincy Jones is and was, always like trying to bring up and coming musicians up with him and use his positions of power and fame to help other people. And then, 2 years later in 1965, the Bob James Trio dropped Explosions on ESP disc, which, as Dustin said, is a amazing record.
Insane.
I've owned that for a long time. And it's one of those cool records where you can play it for people and be like, I bet you never thought Bob James made music like this, but then it has the added value of just actually being a phenomenal record.
And it's also it's got incredible distinction in the world of experimental music because it's got two of the major post-Cagean composers, Gordon Muma and Robert Ashley, basically being sidemen on it or co-composers, which in that world of nerdery, I mean, that's huge. I actually carried, there's a, here in Ann Arbor, there's a 50th anniversary of the Once Festival, like days long celebration. And Robert Ashley, before he had passed away, was here. And I brought my copy of Explosions with me to have him sign it. But it's one of the two times that I've been so intimidated by a person that I wouldn't even go near them.
Well, what was the other time?
Wait,
Go ahead. Don't be nervous.
I'm trying to think of what it was because I've been saying two times, but now I can't remember what the other one was because I did when I met Ron Ashton, I couldn't spit out a full sentence. I said something to the effect of, "Your guitar, man, thank you." So I guess that's kind of a full sentence. But he was very sweet and gracious. He like asked if I wanted a photo taken with me, and I just like, like nervously nodded. And
Was this in Ann Arbor?
that was in Detroit. That was at
Okay.
the C-pop gallery. There was an art show going on where all of the then surviving members of the Stooges had a piece of art in it.
Oh, okay.
And of course, I went to see the art, not the people. Just kidding.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, that's awesome though. Ron Ashton is definitely great guitarist. Someone who laid it down differently.
yeah,
So it's cool that you got to at least say the word guitar to him.
Yeah.
So he's still with us.
yeah.
All right. So back to Mr. James. So post 1965, here's where it starts to make sense of the shift in music. He was doing a lot of like freelance work as an arranger, session player, and he said he was doing very well at that. And at some point moved to New York City, and then also became a regular pianist for Sarah Vaughan. And did a lot of work with her in like the late 60s, early 70s. At somewhere along the lines in late 60s, early 70s, he reconnected with Quincy Jones, who hired him for some studio work and some arranging on an album he was doing. The two of them worked together on a handful of albums. And another person who was in the studio that day was a man named Creed Taylor,
Yes.
who was
CTI.
getting his CTI record label off the ground and recognized the talent in this young Bob James guy. And I'm not sure when he was officially asked to be a part of the CTI camp. I think it was like 73 or something like that. But he had worked on a handful of CTI and Kudu albums before dropping Bob James 1. You can find him on some Grover Washington Jr. records, Hubert Laws, Chet Baker, Gabor Szabo, Stanley Turrentine, Eric Gale, and others.
Johnny Hammond.
Yep.
He was
That's
on our
another one.
Johnny Hammond album we did.
Mm-hmm.
Higher Ground.
So yeah, then in 1974, he dropped his third debut record, Bob James 1. Which was fairly successful. It's not the most successful record that CTI ever put out, but it was successful enough that he was able to follow that up with a new album every year for the next 3 years. Bob James 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then in 1977, CTI was starting to run into some financial problems. They had switched distributors to Motown, and that wasn't working anymore, and the label was basically folding. So Bob skipped town and started his own record label, Tapon Z Records, as a subsidiary of Columbia.
Yeah.
Put out the record Heads in 77 and then Touchdown in 1978. There's a couple other artists that have been released on Tapon Z, mostly CTI collaborators up until that point. You got like some Richard T records, Mongo Santa Maria, a handful of others, but it was mainly a label to just release Bob's own music so that he could have complete control over the creative process and the licensing and everything.
Yeah. I'd always seen that on the label, Tappan Z, and I never thought to actually look into what it was. I'm like, well, I've never seen this on any other records. And it's named after the Tappan Z Bridge, wherever that may be.
In New York.
It is in New York. Okay.
Yep. I'm not quite sure like why it was named after that, if there's like a bridge he used often in his commute.
He seems obsessed with it.
Yeah, I don't know.
It comes up more than once.
Right, because it's the title of a song, and
His label.
yeah.
He is enigmatic.
Like we said, he just kind of kept falling ass backwards into success, it seems like. You know, he got on ESP disc, he started working with Sarah Vaughan, had these successful groundbreaking records with CTI, was able to start his own label, and, you know, had the theme song to a very popular sitcom. And then after this, it just kept going. Like after this record is when he started winning Grammys and started like really doing his world tours. And then eventually he started a group called Foreplay, which was like we talked about, you know, later on in the 80s when they started like capitalizing on the smooth jazz movement and labeling things that he just rode that trend. Was like, all right, well then I'm going to start a smooth jazz supergroup and just like kill it on that front as well. And he's still working very regularly. He put out a record this year. He composed a symphony that he was commissioned to do, and it just keeps working out for him. He, like you said, he's considers himself to be a very lucky musician and is very grateful for all the unexpected success that he's had throughout his career.
Well, I have to think that some of that success is due to the people he was playing with. And do we want to talk about some of those people?
That's a very good point. I would love to talk about some of those people. You want to run down part of that list?
This is a stacked lineup. I know that we've got, of course, Bob James he's playing the Fender Rhodes, electric Yamaha grand piano, Oberheim synthesizers. We're going to hear one of those shortly, I believe, on the next track we feature. We have Eric Gale, though, who we just talked about last week on the Kid Creole and the Coconuts episode. One of the players on that had worked with Eric Gale. He's on electric guitar. He was on Touchdown in Caribbean Nights and did the solo on Angela. We have Hiram Bullock on electric guitar on most tracks. He does a vocal solo on Caribbean Nights, which I think is the only human voice on the record.
Yep.
And I don't know if we'll hear that section when we get to that track.
And he was a pretty close collaborator with Bob at this point. He did records with him before and after this.
Mm-hmm. We have both Gary King and Ron Carter doing bass duties. Gary King is the electric bass on Angela and Touchdown, the two tracks that we've heard so far. Then Ron Carter, who we talked about, I think it was on the Johnny Hammond episode, the greatest bassist of all time, right, Sean?
Yeah, one could make that argument for sure.
He's on acoustic bass on the other songs, like Sunrunner and Caribbean Nights. And he apparently does a piccolo bass solo on Caribbean Nights. Steve Gadd is on drums, except for on Angela, the theme from Taxi. That is Idris Muhammad, a legendary drummer. I mean, both Steve Gadd and Idris Muhammad are jazz legends.
And for me, both of those drummers are guys that if I see they're on a record, it's worth at least listening to and probably worth buying. Those are some legendary players.
Yeah, Ralph McDonald is providing additional percussion on most tracks. Mongo Santamaria also providing percussion. Dave Sanborn, we mentioned him on alto sax on the title track, Touchdown. And we got Hubert Laws, sibling of Ronnie Laws, who we recently did an episode on. Hubert Laws playing the flute on, I think there's 3 different tracks featuring him on flute, Sunrunner, I Want to Thank You, and Caribbean Nights. And Earl Klugh on acoustic guitar on a few tracks. Then you get into all the like trumpets, trombones, the woodwinds, strings. That's a long list. I don't know if there were any highlight names you wanted to pick out there.
I mean, just John Faddis and Randy Brecker on the trumpets.
Okay.
We mentioned John Faddis as being Madlib's uncle.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay. That is an important detail.
And Randy Brecker was another like smooth jazz, fusion jazz legend that you saw all over the place in some records like this.
I noticed something when I was looking at the credits on this. I've always really liked the album artwork on this. I find it very attractive. I think it really fits the record too. The photography was done by a guy named Buddy Endress, but the art direction and design was by a woman named Paula Schur. She's a major graphic designer and painter and art educator, and she worked for CBS in the 70s on album design. But she's probably, if you look at lists of like 25 graphic designers that any graphic designer should know, she's always on those lists. So I thought that was cool. And this is a really fun album to lay out because the football stretches the length of the front and back cover. And then I really like the insert too, with all the session players pictured, really attractive in green. I've always really liked opening up this album and just looking at it while I'm listening to it.
You know, it's nice to have that full gatefold experience when you're putting on a record and just absorbing it, you know?
And it is staunch in its difference to all other records that will be around it. You're like flipping through and you're like, whoa, it's a football.
It stands out. You can't miss
not
it.
An artsy smear of colors or something. Boom, football.
My favorite thing about the football is that it has Bob James' autograph on it on the backside. It's an official signed NFL Bob James football.
Yeah, famous quarterback Bob James.
The man can do it all.
That's right.
I also just want to say, like, literally every one of the main players on here is someone that we could do an entire episode about for like their solo work.
Yeah.
Just to really like re-emphasize how legendary of a crew this is he's got on this record.
Hell yeah. Well, do we want to go ahead and play the song that features the Oberheim. Was that what we wanted to do next?
That's the next one. Flipping it to side B, track 1, Sunrunner.
Yeah, so Dustin, I don't know if you want to say this before or after the fact, but you find the Oberheim particularly entertaining on this one, or?
Oh God, it's delightful. I think you said that it's like early '80s, like a children's music theme song or something.
Yeah,
It is one of Bob James's tracks that doesn't have at all any of the touches of melancholy that I mentioned earlier.
oh, it's so whimsical.
It's very whimsical.
As cheesy as that synthesizer sound is, I still love it. There's something about artfully mixing in synthesizer to otherwise like mostly standard instruments in a like smooth jazz, jazz funk, soul jazz context. I just love it every time, and that song is no exception.
Yeah, the name Sunrunner fits perfectly for the sound of it.
Yeah.
Getting some strong Mannheim Steamroller vibes off that one too. I think they use the same synthesizer. It's the same sound as someone who grew up listening to a lot of Mannheim Steamroller.
Yeah. While we were listening, I was trying to determine if that was the same synth used on the Disney Main Street Electrical Parade. I was not successful. And it's been a while since I've listened to that theme, so I can't guarantee that, but I'm going to say I've got a hunch.
When I was a kid in the 80s, I had these tapes called Little Thinker tapes, and they would lay out a story for you, like you're traveling in outer space, and then it would pause, and there'd be like 2-3 minutes of music for you to draw the scenario, an interpretation of the scenario, and I swear it was always music that sounded just like that.
So did you find yourself with the urge to draw some things while we were listening to that track?
Oh, I got my crayons out, my paper out. I drew a football with my name on it. This is a full experience, immersive experience for me.
Well, that's just adorable.
It's powerful.
You guys want to talk about what are some artists people should listen to if they like this record, aside from literally every artist that played on this record?
Yeah. How would they do that, Sean? Is there a good place they can go to hear all those artists in one location?
Well, boy, there sure is. I'm glad you asked. I have been making these Spotify playlists to go with every new episode of season 2 so that people can dive in a little further. Got just under 2 hours of more textural, smooth jazz sounds related to Mr. Bob James. Kicking it off with the song Tapan Z by Bob James off BJ4. And then another one of my favorites that I've been wanting to do for a while is Harvey Mason, another legendary session drummer with some amazing solo records. George Duke, we got some Grover Washington Jr., Jeff Lorber, one of my favorite like 80s synth jazz fusion funk guys. His records are fucking awesome. Terrible artwork. You would never think they're good, but goddamn, do some of them slap. And then the unexpected hit, one of the Bob James productions, he did all of Kenny Loggins' first solo record, Celebrate Me Home.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Which I fully stand behind that record. Most Kenny Loggins stuff sucks, but that first record is damn good, and it's, I think, mostly because of the Bob James production on it.
Don't forget Top Gun. The Danger Zone.
I mean, it's whatever. Once you get past the Danger Zone, there's some sleeper hits in the catalog. I got some late period Herbie Hancock, Sunlight, from the album of the same name.
Great
One of
record.
my favorite kind of, no one talks about that record, but it's so good. It's a little smoother and less adventurous than his earlier 70s stuff, but
Yeah,
it's incredible.
It's a completely different vibe, but I mean, that's not even accurate because there's not really a consistent Herbie Hancock vibe, except to say that it's a completely different vibe. That's like, because I mean, if you compare like Sextant, for example, to Inventions and Dimensions, like that's not the same vibe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What a wild man. Can't get his records for $1 though.
No, you sure can't. Wish you could.
Yeah.
Another recent favorite of mine that I want to do an episode on at some point, Phoebe Snow.
Oh.
From her self-titled record. I put San Francisco Bay Blues on there. I think Bob was involved with that record. I think that's why I put that song in there. I don't have time to look it up, but let's just say he was. Put an Eric Gale solo track on there, guitarist on this record. It's actually, I put his soul jazz cover of Hall & Oates' Sarah Smile, which is really fucking good. Great track if you haven't heard that one before. And I put another Fania All-Stars track on there. We put them also on last week's playlist for the Kid Creole and the Coconuts. Couldn't do this playlist without putting a Herbie Man track on there. I put one of the weird tracks, his like Japanese fusion record, Gagaku and Beyond. I don't know if you guys have heard that one.
Nope.
But it's really, really good. I don't see it pop up as often, but it's still only worth like $2 or $3 when you do find it.
Right.
Some Gene Harris solo work, one of my all-time favorite jazz musicians. He started as like a pretty straightforward kind of Ramsey Lewis-esque acoustic soul jazz kind of guy with Gene Harris and the Three Sounds. And then after splitting with them, he started making some really adventurous, very textural music in the 70s for Blue Note, doing kind of his own take on this like new smooth jazz, but with, I would say, generally a lot less cheese, going full jazz funk. Very worth checking out. And then another guy we featured on the podcast before, Stephen Halpern.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we're going to talk about smooth jazz, it kind of makes sense to look at the parallels between that and new age music.
Oh yeah.
And then a little bit of the example of some good jazz and textural crossover with funk music. I put a Maze and Frankie Beverly track on there. We got some full-on fusion jazz from Stanley Clarke off the Modern Man LP that came out, I believe, the same year as this record. And Bobby Humphrey, one of my absolute favorite jazz funk musicians, one of the few ladies in jazz that was leading her own records and just absolutely killing it, doing some really good jazz funk crossover again. And then we close it out with Nautilus, the legendary Bob James track.
And that one, that's the one that you said it's like one of the most sampled tracks in hip hop of all time.
Yeah. One of my favorite 45s to play for like outdoor events and stuff is this kind of compilation track where it's just like 8 different hip hop tracks that have sampled Nautilus all mixed together. It's awesome.
Yeah, I didn't really look into each track. I saw that a lot of the ones from this have been sampled multiple times, but there wasn't any particular track that stood out as anything too major. I know Angela's been sampled by the Souls of Mischief, and DJ Jazzy Jeff featuring Big Daddy Kane did it on The Garden in 2007. They used Angela, the theme from Taxi, but it looked like the other ones, I think every track has been sampled a few times at least on Touchdown.
Yeah, definitely. And he was saying that the song Angela is one of the few songs in his catalog that he doesn't have any say as to who samples it, because obviously it's part of the Taxi soundtrack, so it's owned by that crew and not him.
Interesting.
And one of the things he was saying is that he really enjoys being like the sole person to say yes or no to a sample. And one of his main criteria is just literally whether he likes what they did with the sample or not. And he said the thing that bothers him the most is when people speed up or slow down the song too much.
Oh, no.
Because he said they like put a lot of thought into what the tempo of each track was supposed to be. So he feels like it's a betrayal of his artistic statement to change the tempo.
So here's where his boomer musician uptightness really comes out.
Yeah, exactly. He's like they're only doing that so it would fit the tempo of another sample, and I don't understand why they would just use a different song. I was like, okay, like I guess no one can really expect you to be like familiar with the intricacies and different trends of beat making, but whatever.
Oh man, well we better cut this conversation short. I don't want my perfectly squeaky clean image of Bob James to be tainted here with his boomer opinions.
Well, he also said he doesn't really understand why so many of his colleagues of his age are like adamantly against sampling. He thinks that it's interesting and that it should be allowed, whether he thinks it's a legitimate art form or not.
Yeah. And technically, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't think he counts as a boomer because he was born in 1939, and I think the baby boom is considered after World War II. Important distinction.
That's a good point. Would he be the greatest generation?
Silent generation.
Silent generation? That's what it was. Okay. Well, we've gone silent now. Do we have anything else that we want to touch on regarding Bob James?
I have nothing that I want to touch down on.
I have days of stuff, but I don't want to subject you all to it. So.
Well, you know, we might have to just do a part 2 of Bob James at some point and talk about some of the earlier, weirder stuff.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, this is a good one to start with, though, because it's the one that you're going to find, dear listener, if you go scouring the bins. Don't forget to check us out on Facebook and Instagram. And a reminder that you can support us on Patreon. You can find the link in the show notes or at patreon.com/I'd buy that podcast. Got all different kinds of levels that you can support the show at and get some cool bonus content. Jeremy, closing thoughts on, has anything developed in the last 40 minutes since your opening salvo?
I feel like I have just been like told where the smooth jazz party is at, but I haven't actually like gone to it or like melded in at all, taken it in. So there's like, I mean, like that Wes Montgomery record I brought, that was CTI. That's kind of an on-ramp into there.
Well, the Johnny Hammond and the Ronnie Laws were a little bit too.
Yeah. So I've like, you know, touched the edges of it before, but I don't dislike it. It's just, I mean, I can tell the players are very good at what they're doing, but I still don't feel like I get it.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I'm happy to help in any way that I can. I just want to put
We're
that
here
out there.
for you, Jeremy.
it's got a program designed to indoctrinate.
That's right.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like these are records that do benefit from repeated listens too. I feel like there are layers that reveal themselves.
Yeah, and maybe start at Bob James 1 and then, you know, work your way up to this and also listen to Explosions at some point.
Yeah.
That's the way I went, and I can recommend that path.
Yeah. To be clear, I was in the exact same position as you, Jeremy, at one point in time. So I feel your confusion and suffering.
All right. Well, Dustin, did you have anything that you wanted to plug or talk about before we get out of here?
Nothing I didn't mention at the top of the show. I've been working full time and haven't had as many side hustles as normal.
Yeah. Yeah. Life can get in the way of those things.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, we appreciate you taking some time out from your working schedule to sit down and talk some Bob James with us. This is one, I can't believe we haven't done this record already.
Yeah, we've been talking about it for a while.
Well, it's an honor and a pleasure, I assure you.
Well, thank you for listening to I'd Buy That for $1. My name is Peter Cook.
I'm Sean Hartman.
And I'm Jeremy Ruggles. Are you giving them Caribbean Nights to go out on?
Oh, yeah.
That was the one I liked the most.
Okay. Okay, so you got your foot in the door a little bit.
Yeah, it has the grooviness vibe to me.
Yeah, and this one has the only vocal on the record that we were talking about. I don't know if we'll actually get to that in the portion that we're going to listen to.
Well, let's find out.
We
All
won't.
right.